Last summer, I attended a demonstration outside the Swedish Embassy in London, organised by the English Collective of Prostitutes, calling for decriminalisation and an end to the Swedish model.
2 women have been murdered this week in prostitution, one in Sweden and one in Turkey. Today there is a protest outside the Swedish Embassy calling for an end to the Nordic model, which criminalises clients and decriminalises people selling sex.
What women in Sweden have said is that raids against sex workers in their own home have increased since 1999 when the law was introduced. So the prosecution and arrest and harassment and persecution of sex workers has actually increased since the law was introduced.
Also present was Dr. Jay Levy, whose PhD research, completed at Cambridge University in 2012, focused on the outcomes of the Swedish legislation criminalising the purchase of sex. What led you to begin your research on the Swedish model?
During the course of my undergraduate degree, there was a course on the historical geographies of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which I ended up subsequently teaching on. And I'd always been incredibly interested and sort of personally invested in issues surrounding gay rights and issues surrounding HIV. I moved to Sweden in, yes, it would have been 2008, and I began my fieldwork and I began interviewing, and I'm sort of an ethnographer in terms of how I conduct my research, so, I kept a field diary and all this kind of stuff. Initially, the legislation, it sounded quite interesting and quite good. This focus on the purchase of sex, as changing the authoritative focus from an apparent punitive focus on people who sold sex to people who bought sex. But very, very quickly it became apparent that actually there seemed to be problems with this legislation. At the time the law was introduced, in 1999, a lot of money, several million kroner, I believe, was given to the police, was given to the authorities to sort of clamp down on sex work. But no money whatsoever, as far as I know, was given to social services. No money was given for any social interventions whatsoever at the time of the law's introduction. So even though, purportedly, it was asserted that there'd be this sort of two-pronged approach that, people would be increasingly helped to leave the sex industry or whatever. I've yet to see any evidence that highlights that levels of sex work in Sweden have actually reduced since the legislation. Even though we have this sex purchase law and we have this whole narrative that says that sex workers are victims and they need to be protected, there are other pieces of legislation that are used to directly destabilise the lives of sex workers. And, I was told by a respondent from the Swedish National Police that definitely the police didn't interfere directly with sex workers, and that's simply untrue. I spoke to one respondent who, again, I knew for a few years, and she had been directly targeted at her home. The police had been to visit her on several occasions and ended up telling her that they were going to go directly after her clients. So that really seemed to undermine the assertion that was made to me by that particular member of the police.
So with criminalising clients, what do you see as the effects that has on people in the sex trade?
Well, in terms of the research and fieldwork that I've conducted in Sweden, and to a far lesser extent in Norway, so both states have criminalised the purchase of sex, it seems that in Sweden, following the legislation, levels of street sex work did go down, and certainly there was a targeted policing in Sweden that was directed towards public sex work, very much what was visual. It seemed that the legislation was used and enforced selectively by the police, who could use the legislation to police public space and to moralise and essentially sanitise public space. And, I think we need to see this within the context of Sweden's history of social engineering, of Sweden's history of, additionally, of policing and moralising public space, where previously venereal disease and vagrancy legislation have been used to displace and contain and control publicly working sex workers. Norway's purported reason for introducing this legislation was apparent concerns surrounding human trafficking. But what had actually happened just prior to the law's introduction was that there had apparently been an increase in the number of migrant Nigerian sex workers selling sex in public space in the middle of Oslo. And this had caused widespread concern in the media and amongst politicians. while simultaneously and quite paradoxically being constructed as victims of human trafficking at the same time. So then Norway, I think quite tellingly, looked to Sweden and adopted Sweden's criminalisation of the purchase of sex, seemingly to use it as a displacement tool, as a tool with which to police public space and as a tool with which to displace this unwanted, essentially public nuisance.
So overall within Sweden, there seems to be a lack of harm reduction, would you say?
And there's actually quite a staunch opposition to harm reduction initiatives in Sweden. So the provision of condoms to sex workers. So for instance, social workers that I interviewed in the Stockholm prostitution unit opposed the distribution of condoms during their outreach work. And there was a general opposition to the provision of condoms to people who bought sex, because these people are essentially criminals now. Additionally, in terms of groups that are constructed as problematic or deviant in Sweden, people who use drugs, for instance, one facet of my research has been on what the outcomes of Sweden's prohibitionist drug policy and legislation has been. People who use drugs in Sweden also have difficulties in terms of harm reduction. Needle exchanges aren't widely available in Sweden. People who use drugs can't buy their needles from pharmacies or from shops legally. There's been historically big opposition to substitution treatment and to methadone provision, for example. One of the facets of the legislation is that you have to disclose your HIV status every time you have penetrative sex to everybody. So it can be assumed that if you carry on selling sex successfully, if you're seeing clients, that you haven't been disclosing your HIV status, you've been in violation of the legislation, and therefore you can be incarcerated if you carry on selling sex as someone who's HIV positive. So actually this can serve to act as a disincentive for people to get tested for HIV in the first place. Additionally, following Sweden's incorporation of the HIV legislation within its wider venereal disease legislation, which most European states chose not to do, even though the legislation was very, very broad in terms of who could be incarcerated, we can really see Sweden carrying on the same old Swedish thing of using legislation very selectively against certain groups. So it's like in terms of selectively in terms of street sex work, or selectively in terms of human trafficking with the sex purchase law. And then for the HIV legislation, come the early 1990s, the only people who had been incarcerated were people who sold sex and people who used drugs. Were the only people who have been incarcerated under the legislation, some of them for years at a time.
How's the Swedish model affected people involved in on-the-street sex work? Would you say that's an effect of clients being criminalised, that women are pushed indoors?
I certainly have interviewed respondents, both sex workers and service providers, who have said that following the legislation, sex workers who worked publicly, who worked from the street, who were essentially survival sex workers who very much needed their income, were then absolutely displaced and forced to work underground. I've interviewed sex workers who said, yeah, it was absolutely impossible to work on the street following the introduction of the legislation. And no one seems to know where all of these sex workers went. To argue that they left the sex industry with no resources in place, no additional funding was given in terms of social service provision or anything like that for sex workers when the law was introduced. And so no one really knew where any of these people went. I heard reports of, quite a few reports of sex workers having difficulties in reporting crime, sex workers in having difficulties reporting violent crime and in reporting rape, as well people who had difficulties in reporting being mugged to the police, who were told by the police that they should count themselves as lucky, that the police were helping them, that the police didn't normally help people like that. Negotiating's become difficult for some people because clients are assumedly reasonably concerned about getting arrested because they've been criminalised. Sex workers have to just jump into the car and go without having time to assess the situation and suss out the client and so forth. If one doesn't have as much time as one did before to suss up a situation, to establish the dangers of a situation, that does put someone in a more vulnerable position, vulnerable to danger and so forth. Additionally, in terms of street sex work, following the criminalisation of the purchase of sex in Sweden, this it is argued that this did serve to reduce the number of people willing to buy sex publicly, that these people then started buying sex online or whatever. And at the time of the legislation, this is when the internet took off and mobile phones took off as well. So we can't really be exactly sure what accounted for this shift in terms, online sex work and so forth, whether it was the law or the rise of the internet. But the fact remains that fewer people were willing to buy sex publicly, and as a result, it's argued that competition in terms of street sex work went up, that the number of, because competition had gone up and people could command less income from their transactions with clients, that they were perhaps more inclined to engage in riskier behaviours, to engage in, say, unprotected sex work without a condom, and to offer additional services that maybe they hadn't before, due to the fact that quite simply they couldn't command the same kind of capital. Competition had gone up and there were fewer people willing to buy sex in public spaces. I have heard reports, including from one client that I interviewed, that the criminalisation of the purchase of sex has acted for a disincentive for people who buy sex to report witnessed abuse.
In the UK, there's estimated 80,000 people in prostitution. So in Sweden, is it something like 2,000 to 2,500?
Well, as I said, it's incredibly difficult to make generalisations about a group that's so clandestine. I'm very sceptical of any of these statistics, any of these figures, especially given that this 2,000 figure, 2,500, is a figure that's been bandied about, as far as I can tell, for the last couple of decades. So I'm not entirely sure what it's based on. Either way, irrespective of these statistics, Britain's got quite a big population. Sweden's got around, in the whole country, around the same population as London, basically, if you include all the suburbs and so forth. Population of around 9 million people in Sweden. It's got a very small population. So comparatively, levels of sex work are going to be low compared to a state like England or compared to the UK. What will result from, say, the UK's adoption of a sex purchase law? I think we need to be sceptical. As you were saying, the UK's big. It's got a big population. It's going to have a bigger population who sell sex. I would be concerned that the outcomes of a criminalisation of the purchase of sex in the UK would be incredibly hard to predict, in addition to those that have occurred in Sweden. So I think we must be cautious.
What do you think would be the best thing for people to keep people safe? Obviously, to give exit routes for people who do want to leave the sex trade. But what do you think, legally wise, we should be doing here?
Harm reduction is obviously very, very important. Reducing the harms in terms of active sex work. And I think it can be fairly comprehensively demonstrated that criminalising legislation serves to perpetuate and serves to exacerbate the harms that can be associated with sex work. Therefore, I, like many others, would argue for a state of decriminalisation, and abolishing of criminalising legislation that is used to directly or indirectly destabilise the lives of sex workers themselves. In Sweden, women working together, cooperatively, you can be prosecuted under the legislation for essentially, pimping one another. And I believe the situation isn't too dissimilar in the UK. That is, of course, incredibly problematic, to be using legislation that purports to be legislation for the welfare of sex workers, but actually using it to directly destabilise the lives of sex workers themselves. I think the existence of such legislation, or certainly the on-the-ground utilisation of such legislation, needs to be very carefully considered and critiqued. Because even when you introduce a law, like the sex purchase law, like the criminalisation of the purchase of sex, as we've seen from Sweden, there are often lots of other pieces of legislation that kind of, in everyone's conscious mind, falls by the wayside, but that are used against sex workers themselves. Yeah.
So with regards to street sex work, there's certain areas in the UK, Ilford is one, that they've got this crackdown, and I can't bear it myself. It's like a cleaning up the streets approach. They're forgetting they're talking about real people. Yeah. And there was a young woman, a 24-year-old Romanian woman, who was murdered just the other week, since they've introduced this law that criminalises the clients. It does criminalise the women as well, but it leaves that situation you were talking about where women have to make a quick decision, looking in a car and and they haven't got time to check that client, and if they have to be on their own, there's not well-lit areas where they can be with their friends for safety, taking down number plates.
Yeah. In terms of that, that's very interesting in terms of, and very problematic and very concerning in terms of the policing of public space and how legislation has been and can be used to police public space. So Sweden has a long history in terms of moralising, policing and cleansing public space, and this goes back a long time. Previously, vagrancy legislation, venereal disease legislation has been used to police and sanitize public space, and certainly the sex purchase law seems to have been favoured as a mode of going after street sex work, where the attention of the police seems to have been focused on suspected instances of trafficking that seem to be defined by the nationality or background of whatever individual, very sort of crudely defined, or in terms of visible street sex work. And as I've said, I've spoken to respondents who said that, yeah, following the legislation, they felt that they couldn't work in the street anymore.
If the Swedish model was exported to other countries, what do you think the outcome would be?
I think there are lots of things to consider. I think one of the fundamental things is that there isn't a sort of quote-unquote one-size-fits-all solution to a perceived or constructed problem of sex work. What works in one country doesn't necessarily work in another. But the legislation doesn't work in Sweden.
And that's a wealthy country as well.
It's an incredibly affluent country with historically low levels of sex work. Sweden cannot demonstrate that levels of sex work have decreased. It cannot. There isn't any concrete evidence. Absolutely not. Sweden additionally cannot demonstrate the legislation has served to decrease levels of trafficking. It cannot. And so, from that respect, the legislation is an abolitionist failure. The law was supposed to decrease levels of sex work, and it cannot be demonstrated to have done so. In addition to that, there have been, I believe, multitudinous negative outcomes of the legislation and of the discourse surrounding the legislation too. This whole discursive backdrop that justifies the law, this abolitionist, radical feminist backdrop that justifies the law, and the law itself. These have served to inform the views of service providers, inform the views of police, inform the views of healthcare providers, have served to render some forms of sex work, notably the most vulnerable, the lives of the most vulnerable sex workers, as more dangerous. So, empirically speaking, what we can establish as a result of the sex purchase law is that the outcomes of it are certainly not positive, and that it fails to achieve its ambition.